Okay, welcome back. So this is part two, I guess, of going through TechNote 205 by Bangs Laboratories regarding covalent coupling, looking into how to design a protocol for permanently binding molecules. This is a fantastic resource. It really goes into detail about um, the reactive components, which we went through in part one. And now we're looking at other things to consider when creating your protocol. So let's just jump right in, okay? Yeah. So reagent concentration. This is where we left off. This is a important thing to consider because it's all about quantity. How much are you adding into your mixture in order to get the best results? So if you think about it, you have your microsphere and they have a number of binding sites available on the surface of that microsphere. You need to know how much of your ligand to add into the solution in order to cover each of those. Or if you're looking for not 100% coverage, adapt to that. Most likely you're wanting to get full coverage. And this will also go into getting a theoretical number of what to do to get 100% coverage. And then it gives you some tips about practically how are you going to get your best results because, unfortunately, there's always a little bit of a difference there. So regarding reagent concentration, determining appropriate concentrations of different reagents, such as ligand and linker, will be important in controlling surface density. Using too little may result in suboptimal coating and low activity. Using too much may cause bead overload, steric effect with diminished activity, or may simply waste expensive reagent. Antibodies are expensive. You don't want to waste it if you don't need to. Some guidance is provided below and in the general covalent coupling protocols, which we'll go over in part three. So this covers a couple different, pardon me. This goes over a couple different reagents for protein, and this is what I used. It has a great equation to calculate out how much protein you should be adding into your solution. So here's the equation. I highlighted it here, and this is completely based on the molecular weight of your protein. It's supposed to be relating that to the affinity for the bead, but it's not perfect. Essentially, what we've got is some people did good research on the capacity for bovine serum albumin and for bovine antibodies. And you can compare the molecular weight of those two molecules to your particular protein in order to calculate how much to add. It's not perfect though. So once you get your number, you want to adapt it. So let's go through this equation. S is equal to the amount of representative protein required to achieve surface saturation. This is what you're trying to calculate. How many milligrams of your protein do you add? Then you have your density of the solid sphere. This will be provided by the manufacturer. The mean diameter, this is also provided by the manufacturer and is actually one of the main characteristics that you can pick and choose from. And then capacity of microsphere surface for a given protein. This is what you will either be able to find in the literature or may have to estimate just by comparing the molecular weight. So it does a couple good examples of using the equation. It's a very, it's an easy equation. I'll point out here that this density you would get from the manufacturer. This here is the diameter of the microsphere. So they're using microspheres of 1 micrometer. I often used 500 nanometers. So this would be a 0.5 instead for 500 nanometers. And then this is the capacity that is calculated in literature. Once you use the equation, you would find out that you would want to add 18 milligrams of BSA to saturate 1 gram of 1 micron polystyrene-based microspheres. And that is just something that you would measure out and add in at the appropriate point in the protocol. For a larger molecular weight protein, such as this one, which if we compare the sizes, BSA is 65 kilodaltons and BIGG is 150. So it's almost double. And you'll find that you just need to add slightly less. So it's correlated to size. It's not perfect. I'll emphasize that again. Yeah, here it says, and I highlighted this. It's important to note that the resulting calculated value is considered to be a starting point in the determination. I had to make sure my mic was on. This is the second time recording this because it wasn't on the first time. In the determination of optimal protein concentration, the optimal protein concentration may be substantially higher than the monolayer value. That's what this is referencing, a monolayer coverage of the protein, up to 10 times if coupling efficiency is not high, or if high coding density is required. For example, the sample only contains a trace amount of the target molecule. Conversely, much lower amounts of protein may be appropriate if high activity is not required. For example, flow cytometric assay with abundant target, or high activity is not desired. So that's if you're working with proteins. Now, chances are nucleic acids are also extremely popular, so you might be using nucleic acids. And here, the main considerations, I'll read this, for the immobilization of single-stranded nucleic acid probes. As the full length of the oligonucleotide will participate in the hybridization event, high probe density on the bead surface has been associated with reduced hybridization efficiency due to steric effects. Figure 1 illustrates the relationship between probe length and packing configuration surface density. The authors envisioned short probes packing in extended configurations, with long probes existing in more flexible polymeric-like configurations. So basically, if you're working with nucleic acids, you just need to optimize your amount in order to adjust the configurations of your probes. A generic protocol for the covalent coupling of an aminated oligonucleotide to carboxyl functionalized microspheres is provided in TechNote, TechNote 302, Molecular Biology. Covalent nucleic acid immobilization and strategies for addressing hybridization efficiency, for example, the use of a linker controlling probe density, have been documented in the literature. Although it may be necessary to determine optimal probe concentration empirically, the literature is basically where you're going to get your answer. So it's not as easy as the protein, where you can just use the equation to get yourself a starting point. You're really going to need to consult the literature. There are also other biomolecules, including peptides, haptens, hormones, drugs, etc., refer to the literature. So essentially, and since I used protein, this was really helpful for me. But if you're not using proteins, you're definitely going to want to do your background research. Do that anyways, but yeah. Okay. So buffers. This is what it's all about. There are a number of buffers that have been used successfully in covalent coupling reactions. The protocols that follow typically do not contain recommendations for specific buffers, as there is not a buffer that would be ideal for every scenario, scenario being ligand and reactive group. Generally, the pH at which each reaction occurs will be important. So this is what we want to pay attention to. Once we get into the protocol, you'll see they all follow the same format. Activation, binding, quenching, blocking. No matter which microsphere you're using, and therefore which protocol you want to follow, they all use the same process: activation, binding, quenching, blocking. And the buffers are key, because a buffer, if you are new to this, a buffer basically controls the pH or helps control the pH. And if you're trying to bind molecules, you have to be changing the pH in order to change the molecule's ability to bind or not bind. It's very useful. Something that you can do that's very useful is once you've chosen your protocol, go through each step and say, okay, so if pH is this value, then what's happening to my functional groups, which ones are getting activated, et cetera, et cetera. Additionally, the buffer should not contain certain compounds that will interfere or compete with a reaction or ligand. Again, this is talked about in more detail in the protocols, but if you are here, for example, phosphate and acetate buffers can reduce the reactivity of carbidamides and are thus not recommended for use as activation buffers when coupling to carboxyl modified microspheres. In this case, just use MES, which is what I use. Always just use MES. You know, MES is the way to go. I feel like I'm doing that. Okay, anyways. Also, buffers containing free amines, such as tris or glycine, should be avoided when working with amine reactive chemistries. It's very straightforward. If you'll know what you're working with, and then if a buffer also has that, don't use it. Then it provides some recipes for common buffers. PBS is great. Borate buffer, acetate, citrate, phosphate, carbonate, and MES. I like this one if it suits your needs. Finally, antimicrobials. The last stage, so if we go over here, activation, binding, quenching, blocking, and then after that, what are you doing with it? You are storing it. If you're going to be using your reagent that you've made more than once, you have to take into consideration the long-term storage of your solution. So sometimes you can add in an antimicrobial to the storage buffer, particularly for long-term storage. Antimicrobials should be carefully selected as they may exhibit differing stability, involve special disposal considerations, etc. Take into consideration. Something else that you can add to your long-term storage solution are blockers. And this is the last step in all the protocols. Blocking agents are often coated on beads via adsorption following the coupling reaction. These compounds are used to minimize non-specific interactions between the coated bead and non-target molecules in the sample. For example, hydrophobic interaction between proteins and polymer surface. The blocking agent should be selected carefully to ensure that it is effective in minimizing non-specific interactions. Certain blockers may interfere with the test or assay, or they may even contribute to non-specific binding. So blockers can help you eliminate non-specific binding, but just like the buffer, you want to be cross-checking the components, the reactive agents that you're using, and make sure that your blocker isn't actually going to hop onto the train of reactive agents. And they're often added to the storage buffer in varying amounts. A separate incubation and a higher concentration of blocker up to 1%, which is pretty high, is also recommended before storage in order to saturate the exposed surfaces of the microspheres. And that's that blocking step. So if you're getting a feel for this, it's that not only are you trying to bind your microsphere to your ligand, but you want to think about how many ligands are going to coat the surface of my microsphere. Are there going to be functional groups sticking off of my microsphere that don't get covered by a ligand, maybe because you didn't add enough, or maybe because you used a buffer that actually took that space, or is it because you're using a blocker? And then this is why you could use a blocker, because if there are some extra spaces, then you can use a blocker to take those so that it's not later going to be binding to itself and creating self aggregation. So that's what you can be using a blocker for, to take up those exposed surfaces intentionally. Commonly used blockers include, BSA, casein, peptidase, non-ionic surfactants. This one is very useful. I've used this a lot, particularly tween 20. Sometimes it can decrease your aggregation so much that it will hamper your sensitivity and the signal that the amount of signal you're producing. but it is also very useful at decreasing self-aggregation. This was really interesting. I actually just learned this in reading this now. Irrelevant antibodies, often used when conjugating a specific IgG to microspheres. For example, if coupling mouse IgG, rabbit, or any non-cross-reacting IgG can be absorbed as a blocker. That was interesting. Fish skin gelatin, okay. PEG, this is great. This is also used a lot. It's a very versatile blocker available in a number of sizes. It's very customizable. Definitely worth looking into. Sera, non-cross-reacting sera, such as horse or fish serum, are highly inert in terms of cross-reacting with various types of antibodies. That's definitely interesting. And then commercial blockers, huge world out there. You can dive into it. Most likely, you don't need to go that route. But if you're in industry, for example, or if you're really trying to mass produce things, then, or if you just have a ton of funding, go for it. Okay. Bead handling. So I already filmed the sample coupling protocols, so let's ignore this. Bead handling, this is key. Essentially, since you're pipette mixing, vortexing, centrifuging, you're handling these beads a lot. And so first of all, just take care when you're doing that. But most importantly here, investigators should consider bead washing procedures, which may affect coupling efficiency, bead loss, etc. And process controls should be implemented to monitor monodispersity, e.g. microscopy, sizing, turbidimetry, and treat aggregation if observed. This is huge. So, for example, if you have finished your reagent preparation and you're loading it into your immunoassay to look for clumping between the microsphere and antibody to any target antigen, if you haven't washed your microsphere reagent, then there's a very good chance there's already self-aggregation happening in there. That's just the nature of it. Even if you've used blockers and even if you've thrown in the tween 20, you can still get non-self-aggregation. So this is where you use bead washing procedures. It's called a soft wash, and it basically just takes out any clumps that are pesky little clumps that are sticking around. So you should always be doing that at the end of your experiment, and I will go through that in the protocol video. The second thing you should be doing is if you can optically see your beads, look at it under a microscope. Make sure that the size distribution looks similar. Make sure there's no clear massive clumps, tiny ones. It needs to be as monodisperse as possible. And this is where you should be an absolute perfectionist. Like, get it as monodisperse as possible. You can also be using UV-vis spectrometry to estimate how much protein remained in the solution. There are just a ton of steps here. And so the characterization and the fine-tuning of your solution at the end is so important. Finally, there are other parameters that may be evaluated, including incubation times, temperatures, order and rate of reagent addition, etc. They provide a couple examples of bead coating design and optimization processes. Just be referencing the literature as much as you can. However, like, the whole point of this video is I'm wanting to raise awareness about this great documentation that is a good starting place if you're just looking into getting going with this. Yeah. Okay, perfect. I think that finishes up this. So now all that's left is going through the coupling protocols. And here they base it off the type of microsphere. And it's not only a good resource to use for actually getting ready to get started in the lab, but it's also a good final step to really make sure you have a grounded, intuitive understanding of the steps happening here to permanently bind these biomolecules together. This is the welding. This is the cool part. Okay, we'll see you then.